For 160 years, the skeleton of a woman named Sarah Baartman sat in a Paris museum. Her brain was preserved in a jar. Her genitals were preserved in a separate jar. They were labeled. They were cataloged. They were stored on a shelf alongside other specimens. The label on that shelf did not say Sarah Baartman. It said Hottentot Venus. That phrase was part of the dehumanization. Hottentot was a slur, a Dutch word mocking the languages of the Khoi people. Venus was sarcasm, the Roman goddess of love and beauty slapped onto a woman Europe wanted to stare at but refused to see. The label was a joke at her expense, one that lasted 7 generations. But the real horror of Sarah Baartman's life is not only what happened after she died. It is how deliberately she was turned into an exhibit while she was still breathing, and it is how thoroughly Europe tried to forget her afterward. This is the story of a woman who was taken from South Africa, exhibited in London and Paris, dissected by one of the most famous scientists of the 19th century, and left in a drawer until the late 20th century. It begins with a contract she should never have signed and a courtroom that called it consent. It is also the story of how she became a symbol so powerful that her return to South Africa in the year 2002 became a national reckoning. And the question at the center of that reckoning is one we still haven't fully answered. How does a person become a symbol so powerful that the real person almost disappears? The first theft begins near the Gamtoos River. Sarah Baartman was born around the year 1789 in what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa. She was Khoi, part of a community of pastoralists who had lived on that land for millennia. Her childhood would have been shaped by herding, by family networks, by a landscape that runs from coastal flats to inland mountains. That is all we can say with certainty. The written record of her early life is almost empty. The voices that recorded her later life were not hers, and not her people's. What we know of her origins arrives through colonial documents, through the men who claim they owned her time, her labor, her body. By her late teens, Baartman was living in the household of a man named Peter Caesars in Cape Town. She worked as a domestic servant. The exact legal status of that arrangement is one of those details the colonial archive treats as a minor paperwork issue. The balance of historical opinion leans towards slavery in everything but name. She was not free to leave. She was not paid fairly. She could not read or write the languages of the men who controlled her movements. Then came the contract. In the year 1810, a British ship's doctor named Alexander Dunlop entered the picture. He and Caesar saw an opportunity. Europe had a growing appetite for what the era politely called human curiosities, freak shows, living exhibits. Africans in particular were being paraded on stages across London and Paris and beyond. Not as performers, but as physical proofs of a racial mythology. Europe was busy inventing. Dunlop and Caesars believed Sarah Baartman would be spectacularly profitable. Her physique, in particular her sthedopegia, the pronounced accumulation of fat on the buttocks that is a genetic trait in some Khoi women, would, they thought, draw enormous crowds. They told her she would make money. They told her she would see the world. They told her what they needed her to believe so she would sign. The document she was given was meaningless as protection and devastating as a trap. They promised a share of the profits. They promised her return to South Africa after a period of exhibition. She put her mark on it. That mark has been read as consent by some historians and as evidence of coercion by others. The truth lies in the power different. Baartman was illiterate in Dutch and English. She had no independent legal counsel. She was living under the control of a man who saw her as an asset. In what meaningful sense could a young woman in those circumstances refuse? She could not. She boarded the ship. The Gamtoos River disappeared behind her. London waited. The exhibition began almost immediately. Sarah Baartman was placed on a raised platform in a rented room at 225 Piccadilly in the heart of London's entertainment district. She wore a tight, flesh-colored garment designed to simulate nudity. She was instructed to stand, to turn, to walk, sometimes to sit while customers crowded in and stared. She wore beads, feathers, and other accessories meant to signal exotic and primitive. The audience paid 2 shillings each. They poked her. They laughed. They drew caricatures that exaggerated her body into grotesque shapes and sold them on street corners. Her stage name was printed on the posters, the Hottentot Venus. She had no choice. A woman whose legal personhood has been systematically denied by the colonial structures that brought her there does. The show became a sensation. It also became essential. Not because London suddenly developed a conscience about human dignity, but because the cause of abolition was politically charged in the year 1810. The African institution of British Abolitionist Society attempted to bring a legal case against Cheezars and Dunlop. They argued Baartman was being exhibited against her will. They argued she was enslaved under British law. The slave trade had been abolished in 1807, though slavery itself would not be outlawed in the empire until 1833. The case fell into that contested legal gap, and Baartman herself was called to testify. She appeared before a court. An interpreter translated her words from Khoi into Dutch and from Dutch into English. She was asked whether she performed willingly. She said yes. She was asked whether she was being held against her will. She said no. The court accepted her testimony, and the exhibition resumed. But what did that yes actually mean? Sarah Baartman was alone. She was in a foreign country where she knew no one outside her handlers. She had no independent income. She had no legal representation of her own. If she had said no, what would the court have done? Deported her back to the Cape, where she would return to the same men who had brought her? Left her on the streets of London with no resources? Her yes was shaped by every possible constraint. It was a survival answer, not a statement of freedom. The court chose to hear consent where there was only the shape of consent. The case was closed. London eventually grew bored, as London does. The crowds thinned. The money slowed. A new manager entered the scene, an animal exhibitor named Henry Taylor. He took her to France. Paris in the early 19th century was a city in love with science, or at least in love with a particular version of science. The comparative anatomists at the Jardin des Plantes and the natural history collections believed they could map the hierarchy of the human species by measuring skulls, limb proportions, pelvic angles. Georges Cuvier was the undisputed master of this craft. He was a brilliant anatomist, a foundational figure in paleontology, and a committed believer in the racialized ordering of humanity. When he heard about the Hottentot Venus, he was curious. He came to see her. By this point, Baartman had been on display for more than 4 years. Her body was exhausted. Her spirit, by all accounts, was wearing thin. She was still exhibited, sometimes in private drawing rooms, sometimes in less reputable venues. She was also painted by artists. She was examined by physicians. She was steadily transitioning from a stage curiosity to a living specimen. Cuvier sketched her. He noted her measurements. He filed her away in his mind as a case study waiting to be completed. She did not have to wait long. Sarah Baartman died in Paris in late December of the year 1815. She was around 26 years old. The cause was likely a combination of pneumonia, alcoholism, and the accumulated wear of years of exploitation. The details of her final days are sparse. We know she was alone, impoverished, stripped of whatever small earnings her handlers had promised. Her death was noted in a few official records, and then almost immediately overtaken by what happened to her body. Georges Cuvier came to claim it. The dissection began within hours. Cuvier was not a quiet amateur in a basement. He was the most famous naturalist in France, and he turned his full forensic attention on Sarah Baartman with the same rigor he had applied to prehistoric elephants and fossil fish. He dissected her muscles. He measured her bones. He removed her brain. He removed her genitals and preserved them in formaldehyde. He made a full-body plaster cast, capturing every surface detail of her body in a permanent white shell. Then he wrote. His paper, presented to the French Academy of Sciences, was called Extrait d'observations faites sur le cadavre d'une femme connue à Paris et Londres sous le nom de Venus Hottentot. He described her in exhaustive anatomical language as a link between apes and humans. He used her body to argue for a racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top, and Africans, especially Khoikhoi women, near what he considered the bottom. The paper was widely read. It was cited. It became part of the foundation of what we now call scientific racism. The parts of Sarah Baartman were distributed across the collection. Her skeleton was mounted. Her preserved brain and genitals were stored in jars. Her plaster cast was painted to resemble bronze and stood on a pedestal. These items were not hidden away in a back room. They were displayed. They were teaching tools. They were proof of a theory that needed her body to look like evidence. The cast is worth pausing on. It was made by a process that coated her skin in wet plaster section by section, immediately after her death. When the plaster hardened and was removed, it held the imprint of her form in 3 dimensions, a hollow negative that would be filled to create the positive cast. That cast became the stand-in for Sarah Baartman in the museum. It could be stared at without protest. It could be wheeled from room to room. It did not age. It did not require burial. And it kept being shown year after year, decade after decade in a museum that insisted it was celebrating human diversity while displaying a stolen body as a type specimen of inferiority. For most of a century, the remains sat in the Musée de l'Homme. Then, at some point in the 1970s, the museum decided to remove the most sensitive body parts from public display, the brain jar, the genital jar, and moved them into the reserve collection. The skeleton stayed visible for longer, but eventually even the skeleton was taken down and placed in a storage drawer. The decision was not made out of moral reckoning. It was made out of shifting exhibition aesthetics, a mild institutional embarrassment, a feeling that the public no longer needed to see these particular objects. But no one thought to send her home. For another 30 years, Sarah Baartman's remains were stored in the back corridors of a French museum. They were listed on inventories. They were occasionally requested by researchers. They were not secret. Anyone who looked could find them, but they were also not acknowledged in any way that recognized what they actually were. They were not human remains to the museum. They were specimens. That distinction matters. A museum specimen is a thing you own. A museum specimen has a catalog number. A museum specimen belongs to the institution that holds it, and the institution decides when it is seen, when it is hidden, when it is studied, when it is forgotten. Human remains in a museum exist in a category that laws and ethics are still struggling to define. But for most of the 20th century, the definition was simple. If the museum acquired it, the museum kept it, unless someone with enough power forced them to give it back. And for the longest time, no one with enough power knew Sarah Baartman's name. She sat in that drawer. Her skeleton lay in its box. Her brain floated in its jar. Outside, Paris moved through its decades. South Africa endured apartheid and then began the painful birth of its democracy. The world changed. She didn't. She waited. Then, in the late 20th century, a poem was written. And the poem was not written in Paris or London. It was written by a South African woman who had learned Sarah Baartman's story and felt it lodged somewhere deep in her throat. The poem would travel. It would be read aloud in parliaments. It would become one of the reasons a president demanded her country's daughter be returned. But before that could happen, a question had to be asked. A question France did not want to hear. How do you steal a woman who is already dead? How do you hold someone prisoner for a century and a half and call it science? And what would it take to finally bring her home? Her remains sat in a drawer, forgotten. But the poem changed everything. And the question rose, how could a woman be stolen twice? The answer began with a poem. In 1998, a South African poet named Diana Verwoest was studying in the Netherlands when she came across a documentary about Sarah Baartman. Verwoest had grown up hearing fragments of the story, but seeing the images of the pickled remains and the plaster cast lodged something cold in her throat. She sat down and wrote a poem she called, "I've Come to Take You Home." In the poem, she spoke not to the audience, but directly to Sarah. She said, "I have come to take you home, where the ancient mountains will weep for your dignity." The words traveled. They were read aloud in the South African Parliament. They were printed in newspapers. They were handed out at rallies. And they did something no legal brief had yet managed to do. They made the French government hear a name it had spent over a century ignoring. 2 years earlier, in 1994, the newly elected president of a democratic South Africa, Nelson Mandela, had sent a formal request to the French government. The request was direct: return the remains of Sarah Baartman. The timing was deliberate. South Africa was rebuilding itself after apartheid, reclaiming its history, demanding accountability. Baartman's story wasn't just a historical footnote. It was an open wound. Mandela understood that a nation's memory couldn't heal while its daughter was still locked in a Paris museum drawer. The French government acknowledged the request, and then it did nothing. The objection was procedural. The Musée de l'Homme held the remains as part of the national collection. Under French law, museum holdings were inalienable. You couldn't just give them away. To return the skeleton, the brain, the plaster cast, every pickled fragment, you'd need a special act of parliament. The museum itself argued that the remains were of scientific importance. They'd been studied for over a century. They were part of the historical record. They belonged to science, to the French people, to the patrimoine, to the French legal mind. Sarah Baartman was not a person. She was a specimen with a catalog number. And a catalog number doesn't have a right of return. But the poem reframed the question. It asked not whether the remains were scientifically valuable, but whether keeping them was a continuation of the original crime. The poet had done something the diplomats couldn't. She had made the French public feel the weight of the claim, and slowly the political calculus shifted. South African officials pressed the case in back channels. Scholars and activists in both countries built a growing archive of moral and legal arguments. The University of Geneva Art Law Center produced a detailed study laying out the ethical and legal obligations. They argued that France's own laws on human dignity made the retention of Baartman's remains indefensible. The remains were not an ordinary museum object. They were the body parts of a woman who had been trafficked into a life of exploitation, dissected without consent, and displayed as a racist caricature. Keeping them was not science. It was trophy keeping. The evidence for this was abundant. The plaster cast that Cuvier had made, the one that had sat in the museum for decades, was itself a document of the crime. It captured her body in the posture of exhibition, stripped of personhood. It had been used to teach generations of students that some bodies were proof of inferiority. Every time the cast was shown, the original violation was repeated. French museum officials had long treated this as routine. But now the cast was being introduced as Exhibit A in a new kind of trial. Not a criminal trial, but a trial of memory. The question was no longer whether the cast existed. It was whether it could be allowed to exist as a possession of the French state. The legal battle dragged on. The South African ambassador made repeated petitions. French politicians and intellectuals debated the principle. The museum community split. Some argued that returning the remains would set a dangerous precedent, opening the floodgates for countless repatriation claims. Others argued that this was precisely the point, that European museums were full of bodies taken under similar circumstances, and that the ethical reckoning was overdue. The Baartman case became a test. If France could not return a woman whose story was this clear, what hope was there for other claims? Then, on the 6th of March 2002, the French National Assembly voted. The law was short. Its title translated to Law Authorizing the Restitution by France of the Mortal Remains of Sarah Baartman to South Africa. The vote was unanimous. Everyone who was present said yes. Not a single deputy voted to keep her. The Senate had already passed the bill on the 21st of February that same year. The president signed it into law. After 192 years, the legal machinery had finally, reluctantly, done the right thing. The remains were no longer an inalienable piece of the French patrimoine. They were human beings' remains that needed to go home. Preparations began immediately. The skeleton, the brain, the genitals, the plaster cast. All of it was removed from the museum's reserve collection. The jars were sealed. The drawers were emptied. The space where she had lain for generations became just another empty shelf. A delegation from South Africa arrived in Paris to receive her. On the 29th of April 2002, a ceremony was held at the South African Embassy. The remains were placed in a coffin draped in the South African flag. Then they were flown home. The arrival in Cape Town was a national event. Thousands of people lined the streets. The coffin was taken to a mortuary to lie in state. People came to pay their respects, many of them for the first time using her name aloud, Sarah Baartman, Sarch Ye. The diminutive form she had been given by her Dutch-speaking employers, the name she had been exhibited under, the name that had been used in Cuvier's autopsy report. Now it was spoken as a name of mourning, not of display. On the 9th of August, 2002, Women's Day in South Africa. The funeral was held. The day was chosen deliberately. Women's Day commemorates the 1956 march of thousands of women against the past laws. It is a day of resistance, of dignity, of the strength of South African women. To bury Sarah Baartman on that day was to place her not in a story of victimhood, but in a story of reclamation. The ceremony took place in Hankey, in the Eastern Cape, in the valley of the Gamtoos River where she had been born. A hillside overlooking the river was chosen as her grave. Government officials spoke. Traditional Khoisan leaders performed rituals. Diana Farah stood and read the poem that had helped bring her home. And then the coffin was lowered into the red soil. The earth covered her. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Sarah Baartman was not an exhibit, not a specimen, not a legal case. She was a woman who had been laid to rest by her own people. The plaster cast was not buried with her. Neither were the other remains. They had been respectfully prepared for burial, but the cast was an object, not her body. It was, in some sense, still a witness. The cast still exists. It was returned to South Africa along with everything else, but it is now held by the South African government, kept as part of the historical record. Some people argue that it should have been destroyed, that an object made to humiliate should not be preserved. Others argue that keeping it is a form of testimony, that the cast now serves as evidence of what was done to her. It is a mirror. When viewed, it does not show Sarah Baartman. You see the colonial gaze that made her into a thing. And that makes it a different kind of object now. An object that tells the truth about the people who made it, not the woman who was captured by it. The repatriation of Sarah Baartman's remains was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new conversation. Museums across Europe began to face similar demands. Human remains collected under colonial rule In circumstances of extreme power imbalance, were suddenly being seen as urgent moral questions, not storage problems. The Baartman case set a precedent. It showed that the law could be changed, that the argument from scientific value could be overridden by the insistence on human dignity. But it also exposed how much work remained. How many other remains are still sitting in drawers, cataloged, forgotten, waiting for someone to remember their names? For all the symbolic power of the burial, the real Sarah Baartman remains partly unreachable. We have no diary, no letters, no testimony in her own words that we can trust, because every transcript we have was filtered through her interpreters, her captors, her dissectors. The archive is a crime scene that was contaminated from the start. We know the shape of her life: the Gamtoos River Valley, the long voyage to London, the stages, the courtroom, the dissection table. But the inner life, the woman who laughed, who cried, who may have loved, who may have dreamed of home, that person is gone. The symbol has, in a sense, absorbed the person, and that is both a victory and a loss. A victory and a loss. A victory because the symbol now works in service of justice. Her name is invoked in restitution debate. Her image, once used to humiliate, is now handled with care if it is shown at all. She is a warning, a loss, because the real woman, the one who died at 26 in a foreign city, surrounded by people who saw her only as a scientific opportunity, that woman cannot be recovered. We can know what was done to her. We can know what was done to her. We can know her. The question that was asked at the beginning, how does a person become a symbol so powerful that the real person almost disappears, has no clean answer. But the fight for Sarah Baartman's dignity did something no dissection ever could. It forced Europe to look at the cast it had made of itself. The cast is not Sarah Baartman. It never was. It is a portrait of a scientific racism that refused to see a person. And by bringing the cast home, South Africa didn't just reclaim a body, it reclaimed the right to define the meaning of that body. The meaning is not in the pickled organs or the catalogued bones. The meaning is in the long, stubborn refusal to let her remain a specimen. That refusal is a kind of testimony, too. It is the testimony of everyone who remembered her name, who wrote her a poem, who cast her as a daughter of the nation, who stood on a hillside in the Eastern Cape and wept when the soil finally covered her. It is a testimony that says she was more than what they did to her. She was a woman, and she is home.